Thanks very much, Marie-Laure, for joining us. We have a great keynote speaker. I was almost sure that she would just refuse our request because she's overcommitted, but she said she would do this with pleasure. I think because civil society is also at the heart of her work, and maybe also at her heart. I will just briefly introduce her, and then we can go into the keynote. And as I said, just a brief commenting from my side before we go into the group discussion. So probably all of you know Marie-Laure. She's serving on the board of EGOS, and by the way, will be serving on a sub-plenary tomorrow on a panel about making academic lives more meaningful. I think that's a very worthwhile topic and should be an interesting discussion. She's studying business and society topics, mainly from a sociological tradition. I think her PhD from Harvard is in fact also in sociology. I think what she and sort of the Heidelberg crowd, Helmut also joined us, have in common is that she's got a fancy for Weberian tradition and theory, especially a focus on institutionalism, in the sense of that economic activity needs to be embedded in the larger context to be analyzed in a proper way, and also some other theme that she's drawing on is Karl Polanyi's New Great Transformation. I think there's going to be a couple of relations in her talk as well, so that economic dynamics and logics have intruded or imposed themselves on a lot of our lives or a lot of parts of our lives. And we'll see how she draws this out in her keynote. At the moment, she's still, I think, Dean of the School of Management and Innovation at Sciences Po, but is the incoming, and that's worth noting, the first female director of the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And what I found quite interesting, especially from a social impact perspective, is that she was serving on the steering committee of the International Panel for Social Progress, which is a follow-on, I think, from the Stieglitz and Fitoussi commission that was initiated by the French government. I believe it was Nicolas Sarkozy at the point still, thinking about social progress and ways to assess it. And so Marie-Laure will discuss the role, at least that's what I think. So all of this has been quite spontaneous, of civil society countering or reacting to current political and social shifts and threats. So I'll give the floor to her.
Thank you very much, Orgi. I think I'm going to talk actually about something quite different, so if you bear with me. First, just one thing that I need to correct. The International Panel for Social Progress is definitely not a follow-up from the Stiglitz Commission, and definitely has nothing to do with Nicolas Sarkozy, whatever, absolutely none. But it's a huge and beautiful project that I'm very proud that I've been associated with, but it's not the place to talk about this. A caveat, what I'm going to talk about is very tentative, it's very preliminary, so you should really bear with me, and I'm really happy to get engaged into the discussion. So I want to thank the four of you, Philippe, Gorgi, Lisbeth, and Gemma, for asking me to do this. Again, very, very, I'll do my best. I hope it's not disappointing, because as Gorgi explained, it's a kind of a very complex period, moving from one place to the other, and many other commitments that I have makes it a bit tough. So I've done my best, but it's certainly something that I will be happy to get your help from, to help me with. Okay, so I'm going to try to share this. Normally it works. Is that okay? Yeah, everybody sees it? Okay, so the title of this talk is Civil Society Organizing and Beyond, with a question mark, bringing social Darwinism back. And I'm going to actually take a bit of a sidestep to the discussion that you guys are having within the sub-theme, which is the discussion of the place and roles shifting, transforming places and roles of, if I understand it correctly, of civil society organizing in the context of welfare agendas, welfare societies itself, profoundly shifting, as we know. So I'm going to try to take a bit of a provocative sidestep, and we'll see what you guys think about it. So first, if I manage to make this move. Okay. So the first thing is really kind of, you know, being a bit on the same page in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about welfare. You know, this is an attempt to create a kind of typologization of architectures of welfare along here 2 dimensions, and it could be obviously much more complex than that, but you know, this is a first proposition. I guess the main dimension is this notion of whether or not actually welfare is embedded together with economic activity, or whether or not welfare is actually considered to be something that is entirely or should be entirely separate from economic organizations, whatever their form. So the embedded, disembedded dimension here is a very important one. And then I can just put up this micro, meso, macro dimensions. So, you know, again, this is a very tentative start of trying to kind of map what we've seen, or what we can see potentially in human history, you know, throughout, but, you know, to be a bit more reasonable, over the last 150 years or so, different paths, different perspectives on where does welfare take place, or who should be responsible for welfare. You know, that's really the idea. Again, this is a typology. It doesn't mean that it's either or. It can mean that you have a variable kind of you know, kaleidoscopic kind of constructions where those different things kind of fit together in kind of different ways with different amounts, etc. But I think that, you know, it allows us to really try to think a bit more analytically about the architectures of welfare. So if you think about the same question, you know, where does welfare take place? Who is in charge for welfare activities? Who should be responsible for it? In what way? Etc. etc. And if we think about the neoliberal turn, you know, from the 1980s forward, I want here just to underscore some trends. And again, it doesn't mean that, you know, we are going only in one direction, and that direction is exactly the same for all countries, for all regions, etc. Just, you know, shows broad trends that are having an impact in different ways, different forms across the world. A first trend is a weakening of the welfare state that we know quite well, but a weakening of the welfare state is, again, by all means, not a disappearance of the welfare states, and certainly not in big parts of the world. But, you know, undeniably, this is, you know, a broad trend that we might wonder whether actually the COVID crisis might not actually, you know, push the pressure backwards on this, at least in some parts of the world. But that's been a trend with us since the beginning of the neoliberal trend. Another big trend is both the privatization and marketization of welfare. I guess you guys are working on this, so you know that perfectly well. And, you know, it takes many different forms, but here I identify a number of things, with the return of paternalism and company philanthropy all over the place, new and kind of revised or revived older forms of civil society organizing, and definitely the inscription of competition and markets in welfare. We know that about education, obviously we live it every day, but health, pension funds, etc., etc. Another dimension, which is obviously connected to that one, but I want to, you know, to kind of identify it analytically here, because I think it's important to really measure its importance, is what I call here, for lack of a better word, a kind of entrepreneurial welfare, which is essentially the trend to increasingly responsibilize individuals for their own welfare. So we are our own welfare startup in a sense. So we should be, you know, taking care of this. Another trend connected with the previous ones is the managerialization. So the weird thing is that you have both a kind of market, the spread of market, and I've written a bit on that. This kind of weird alliance between something which is the spread of markets on the one hand, and weirdly enough, the managerialization, the bureaucratization, in a sense, through management of everything. Which in principle should not be so coherent and compatible, but in the neoliberal turn is really a mix of those two trends. So the managerialization of welfare provision, and again, this is something that you guys know very well, the impact of new public management, the very broad impact on new public management, including on civil society organizations of different kinds. So that's something quite clear. But also obviously on public welfare provision bodies of different types. And finally, the financialization of welfare, which again is, will take very different forms depending on which countries we're talking about, going to extremes in the US and the UK to some degree, much less in other countries, but we find this in education, we find that in pensions, we find that in a number of dimensions of the welfare sector. So broad, sense of what's happening. So this is where I'm getting into shift, kind of like a bit more unstable ground, let's put it that way, and where I'm going to make this proposition that hopefully we can discuss. So the proposition is that there might be still one more radical step that is on one more radical direction that is in process. And again, it's not an either or kind of thing. As I say, it doesn't mean that all those things, all those trends that you guys are working on and that we can see are going completely to disappear. But I would like to kind of, put to make appear, in a sense, a kind of underground trend, which, quite a number of signs, if you look at the current evolutions, is happening. And I see this as a cultural shift, as a very consequential cultural shift that, again, has been increasing since the beginning of the neoliberal turn, and has potentially quite a very profound impact on architectures of welfare, the way we think about architectures of welfare, the way we think about welfare in the first place, in fact. And this cultural paradigmatic shift is a radical ideological turn, or in fact a return, because this is something that's been with us for more than 170 years. It's a return to a new version, new form of social Darwinism, which I would, in the rest of the talk argue is actually maybe, if we follow it, taking us beyond welfare, in the sense that from this perspective, any kind of welfare provision should more or less be discontinued, because in a sense it's actually distorting the natural evolution that should lead us to a superior kind of society, superior kinds of beings, and moral and social and economic progress at the level of the species. So including, that means concretely, with the sacrificing of a certain number of individuals on the path to that superior society or superior species. So a bit of background for those of you who are maybe less familiar with social Darwinism and its origins. So we have to go back to the discussion between Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer, and one of the really important difference between the two, even though they had a lot of discussions, and after a while actually Darwin got in part convinced and in part took over some of Spencer's ideas. Darwin obviously coming prior to Spencer. The big difference is really this idea that evolution is not random. Evolution is actually, in a sense, performative, and it performs progress, and it leads us to progress. And this is the big claim that Spencer is making. Progress is not an accident, but a necessity, and evolution is a progressive, according to Spencer, process, which it's not necessarily for Darwin. Okay, there's much more randomness in Darwin's vision of evolution. So for Spencer, the mechanisms that lead to that progress, that, you know, that the mechanisms of evolution that ultimately should lead us to progress at the beginning of human history are things like war, epidemics, and then progressively those kind of natural mechanisms in a sense are increasingly replaced by competition, and in particular by economic competition, which becomes a very powerful, potent mechanism of the struggle for life, which is the notion also that he mobilizes. And again, if this mechanism of struggle for life is left to its natural dynamics, so including at this stage of evolution where economic competition is the main factor of that struggle for life, then it should bring what Spencer, calls the survival of the fittest and the demise of the weak. And from the perspective of Spencer, again, this is morally good. Okay, it's really not only an observation in a sense, it's not only descriptive of what is happening, it's according to him good that those who survive, which according to him are those who survive in a context where there's no mechanisms to go against the struggle, the kind of natural struggle for life, are going to be the fittest and the strong. And it's good morally that those are the ones that survive, and that on the other hand, the weak should kind of fall by the wayside in a sense. This is a direct quote of Spencer, which really makes the point very clearly. The purifying process continuing still an important one remains to be carried on by industrial war, by competition of societies during which the best physically, emotionally, and intellectually spread most and leave the least capable, the weakest, to disappear gradually from failing to leave a sufficiently numerous posterity. So we know, just one more thing important is that obviously from that perspective, Spencer is very clear about welfare. Okay, his position on architectures of welfare is that there should be none. Okay, in the ideal world for Spencer, any tampering with the natural laws of evolution will create obstacles to progress and to the improvement of the race and of society. So all form of welfare intervention is a kind of tampering with the natural laws of evolution. And in that sense, for kind of the pure Spencer, it should be banished as far as possible. So again, the direct quote, the well-being of existing humanity and the unfolding of it into its ultimate perfection are both secured by that same beneficent, though severe discipline to which the animate creation at large is subject. A discipline which is pitiless in the working out of good, a felicity pursuing law which never swerves for the avoidance of partial and temporary suffering. The poverty of the incapable, the distresses that came upon the imprudent, the starvation of the idle, and those shouldering aside of the weak by the strong, which leave so many in shallows and in miseries, are the decrees of a large, far-seeing benevolence. So really, important to understand that in principle, welfare is immoral from that perspective. So it goes as far as that. So we do know, obviously, the kind of some of the most problematic consequences of a social Darwinian or Spencerian ideology in the 20th century. We know the links with Nazism, we know the links with eugenics, etc. So we know that, but we don't maybe know that social Darwinism and Spencer himself had a very, very, very strong impact on American economy at its beginning, in a sense, at least at its beginning, as in its specific features, which is the turn of the 19th, 20th century. So the robber barons that were really at the origins of this particular form of managerial corporate capitalism that is now still with us as a dominant form of capitalism. And obviously, if you're interested in that, you can go and look at my book, Exporting the American Model, where I tell all this history. So the robber barons invite Spencer in 1882, and they really organized an absolutely triumphal tour for him. And obviously, it's quite easy to understand how Spencerianism, social Darwinism, Spencer way, was a very useful ideology. I'm talking quite Marxist terms here, for those persons, where the robber barons, which had really built their power and their wealth on blood, literally, really with the extreme of killing competitors, etc., for a big part of the Civil War and post-Civil War period, would be able, therefore, to justify those predatory tactics through the sheer fact of having survived, okay, and therefore being, in a sense, superior and the fittest, at least from that perspective. So in that kind of re-evaluation mechanism, through that ideology, the big become the strong, the survivors become the best, and those that will ensure progress of species, progress of society, etc. And the suffering on the road is totally legitimized and totally moral from that perspective. Inequalities are also completely legitimized and fully moral, and that's really quite important, because obviously that period is one of the period where you see a huge increase in inequality, very similar, but maybe less in its extent than the one we're seeing today, but very, very similar in its dynamics to the one we're seeing today. And just to try to, I'm going really fast on this, but try to give you some hints that I'm not just dreaming this up. I took this text from Carnegie, which is really a very famous text, the Gospel of Wealth by Carnegie, one of those robber barons. And that you all know, I'm sure, that this text, Gospel of Wealth, became, in a sense, the Bible of modern U.S. philanthropy, and it remains actually a very important text for modern corporate and and personal philanthropy in the US and across the world, in fact. And if you read that text, you have a feeling that he basically plagiarized Spencer, nothing less. But whether the law be benign or not, we must say of it, as we say of the change in the conditions of men to which we have referred, it is here, we cannot evade it, no substitutes for it have been found, and while the law may be sometimes hard for the individual, it is best for the race, because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every department. We accept and welcome, therefore, as conditions to which we must accommodate ourselves, great inequality of environment, the concentration of business, industrial and commercial in the hands of the few, and the law of competition between these as being not only beneficial but essential for the future progress of the race. So you can see really a very Spencerian and social Darwinian argument here. And then Carnegie goes on then to justify the fact that those superior men that have made money in the context of their private firms are therefore totally and fully legitimate to organize welfare and to be, to in a sense privatize this welfare function because of their superiority and of their capacity to survive. So it's a very interesting way in which you use the success in one sector, business, to transfer it to the legitimacy to act in the name of the common good. And this is when you think about, Bill Gates and quite a few others, this is very much something that is, strongly behind a lot of this, of the philanthropy action of people like this today. So just rapidly on this, I've written on that in a number of papers, so if you're interested, I can share this. Interestingly, when you think about it, there's really a kind of elective affinity dimension between this social Darwinian imagery of the world, or vision of the world, the Calvinist version of the world, and a kind of free market Smithian free market vision of the world. And this cultural triangle, I argue in a number of contributions that I've made, is in fact the spirit of modern capitalism. It's still very much the spirit of modern capitalism. It was the spirit of American capitalism at birth, let's say, 19th century, 20th century, and it has become, because of the exportation of the American form of capitalism to many other parts of the world, it has remained, in a sense, deeply ingrained in that form of capitalism. And I'm summarizing here the ethics of that of that spirit, in a sense, you know, with a number of words. So the prioritization of work, a very strong focus on individualism and utilitarianism. The strong role of competition, even though on that we can spend a lot of time, you know, exploring and opening the black box of what competition has become in the process. It obviously is not a Smithian competition anymore. It's become very much an oligopolistic type of competition that fits with this robber baron type of model of capitalism, but this is too long to, you know, I can't go into that right now. Individual greed and wealth as success markers, so, you know, very connected to what I've just said about social Darwinism, but we know also the Calvinist logic behind that, so the two things really fit very well here. Survival of the fittest, natural equilibrium in the sense that actually you should actually laissez-faire, and you should, you know, reduce intervention as much as possible, because actually, you know, the equilibrium will emerge much better in that context if you you reduce all kinds of intervention. Markets as natural organizing solutions, growth, economy growth as a sacred goal, and progress as equivalent to economy growth, and also scientific control of everything, including of nature, as a tool for all this, in a sense. So this is, you know, in a sense, a kind of very broad, again, we can discuss this and whether everything, you know, is there or whether things missing, but a broad summary of what I see as, in a sense, the spirit of contemporary capitalism, and then I've tried to connect this to, in part, social Darwinism, but there obviously the other dimensions would be important to explore. So if we look at the contemporary period, and again, I connect this more or less with the neoliberal turn in terms of the timing. It's quite clear that we see a re-emergence of social Darwinism. Let's say that right after World War II, there was a high disrepute, in a sense, of social Darwinism because of all the very concrete and disastrous consequences it had before the war and during the war. So there was a period where it was really difficult to bring those, to bring this ideology back. But the argument here is that if you follow intellectual history, but also social history, you see a progressive return from the late 70s forward. There's a very interesting book by a French philosopher, Barbara Stiegler, that came out recently, where she actually nicely brings out the strong connection between the early neoliberal movement, so really the Walter Lippmann colloquium in 1938, even before Montpellier Society met in 1947. And she really shows the strong impact of social Darwinism on the thought of early neoliberals. And it makes full sense because, again, you know, we know that social Darwinism in the first part of the 20th century had a very strong impact on the US in general, but also on US social science. There's been a lot of books written on that. So it makes full sense that actually people like Walter Lippmann and many others who were involved in the early neoliberal movement were, in fact, naturally, in a sense, social Darwinian and Spencerian. So she shows that very, very nicely. And if you follow actually the history of neoliberalism, the intellectual history of neoliberalism, and look at Hayek and others, you really you can see really the thread there, the way in which it's always been there, even during those years where you could not talk about it, but it's always remained there. And, you know, Lippmann says it that way in 22. A free society is a society where inequalities between human beings are not due to artificial or extrinsic causes, which otherwise said is a free society. In a free society, inequalities are perfectly justified and legitimate because they reflect natural differences, biological ones. And this is the underground logic here, which means that if we define our society as free, then inequalities are perfectly legitimate. You know, that's kind of a way in which we can connect to today. Another thread in which social Darwinism has either not disappeared or re-emerged is through the revival of it through sociobiology and the biologization of everything. So a number of important books there that were emerged in the late 70s. Edward Wilson, Sociobiology, which actually has had a very strong impact on evolutionary psychology. There's really a direct thread between sociobiology and contemporary evolutionary psychology, which, as many of you know, is increasing its place and its role in most psychology departments and in many business schools. It's having increasing impact in many business schools. There's this very important book for our discussion from 1994 by Murray and Ernstein, which is called The Bell Curve, which is a book that is really fascinating in its simple social Darwinian perspective, where essentially they totally reduce IQ to race differences. So the reintroduction of race structural differences with this, the kind of underpinnings of social Darwinism here is totally made in a scientific kind of way in that book. Very important to know that Murray and Ernstein, and particularly Murray, is extremely active still today, and he's become very active and his ideas are being very widespread because he's closely connected to a broad array of neoliberal think tank, neoliberal think tank ecology, which I've worked quite a bit on, that is organized through the Atlas hub. And this hub of neoliberal think tanks, more than 500 think tanks across the world, is pushing Murray's ideas, but and kind of reinforcing them in many different ways. Another place where social Darwinism is coming back is through contemporary neurosciences and the reduction of everything, in fact, to neuronal dynamics. Transhumanism also is a hotbed of social Darwinism for many different ways. So what all those things, all those trends have in common is, in a sense, the disappearance of the social. Okay, the disappearance, and if you make the social disappear, and fits very well, obviously, with Margaret Thatcher-like definition of society. There's no society, there's only individuals. So if you make the social disappear, you actually move towards a disappearance for the need of social intervention, and in particular for welfare intervention. The only kind of legitimate intervention, ultimately, and again, I'm pushing the argument, the only kind of legitimate intervention in that context is going to be at the individual level and even really at the biological level. And this fits obviously perfectly well with the transhumanist vision of the world. And so we move towards this transhumanist vision of what I call eugenism 3.0, okay, where actually eugenism is not by kind of, necessarily kind of preventing the weak from having children, which, by the way, and Philip, we can talk about that, but Sweden had this very strong eugenic tradition very late actually, where all countries stopped after World War II. Sweden kept it until the 70s, and we can come back when I talk about the herd immunity debate later. So only form of legitimate intervention at the individual level and mostly biological, and a kind of new form of it. Eugenism, and a reinterpretation of social Darwinism. That's why I call it 3.0. Again, this has strong affinities with transhumanist libertarianism, which today obviously is at the heart of the ideology and philosophy of the GAFAM and of the whole Silicon Valley ecology and community. And it's having strong elective affinities with neoliberal laissez-faire and deregulation agenda. And many I could go on for hours on giving documentary evidence of that. And again, I want to underscore the huge role of the neoliberal think tank ecology in solidifying and spreading this, the death of the social, and therefore the death of social intervention, and in particular welfare intervention, to the benefit of individual responsibilization on the one hand, and manipulation of our biological elements on the other, at least for the richest among us, and the transformation, and therefore, of us into hybrid beings in time. Just, Okay, I'm not sure this is the right illustration, but I just felt I wanted to talk about this. So one illustration is the debate around herd immunity during the COVID crisis, which you're all very aware of. So, very briefly, the herd immunity strategy, the pure version of it, it's basically laissez-faire, okay? Laissez-faire, let the pandemic flow to the point where around 60 to 70% of the population have been contaminated, and from that point on will create a wall of immunity, protecting themselves and others. I've written on that during the COVID crisis. I can send that to you if you want, because it's completely ridiculous in scientific terms, actually, this perspective. Totally ridiculous in scientific terms. The only way you can understand, well, it's in French what I read, and so only for those of you reading French. So the only way in which you can actually understand why it became at all mentioned in a number of countries is through this very strong presence of a social Darwinian ideology in the background in these particular countries. And one of my arguments is that you have a strong correlation between the countries where this herd immunity strategy has been discussed, has been considered seriously, and countries where you do have a strong influence of social Darwinian, social Darwinism. Sweden, again, is kind of this very interesting case, which would be love to discuss more. So obviously US, UK, Brazil are very easy to connect to sort of strong role of social Darwinian ideology, particularly at the top, at the leadership of those countries. Because obviously a strategy like this one, in the context, normally actually, the reason why I say that it's a kind of, it doesn't make any sense scientifically, is that the herd immunity strategy is obviously discussed by biologists, but most of the time it's discussed in the context where you have a vaccine, okay? And so basically biologists and doctors use it to say we need to at least vaccinate 70 or 80, or actually most of the time it's 90% of a population, so that we create the herd immunity. So in the case of COVID, it's been used where we didn't have a vaccine, okay? And it's been used in a way that obviously, if you are going to have a herd immunity strategy, you are going to have to accept a much higher level of death. So it was very surprising how little this was discussed, okay? It's been discussed a bit, but not so much. A huge cost of human lives that goes with that strategy, and Sweden has shown that very concretely. Empirically, we can see the difference between Sweden and Norway and other Nordic countries in terms of the percentage of deaths that happen, much higher than in other countries. So it's it's been kind of a natural experiment there. So in a sense, this acceptability of the death is obviously, compared to what I just said, I mean, relative to what I just said, will be much easier in a context where the weak should die. Okay, from the perspective of social Darwinism, the weaker should die, and it's morally good. It's morally acceptable that the weak and the vulnerable should die, in fact, in the end. Again, this herd immunity strategy has been discussed a lot. It's been proposed, it's been pushed by a number of actors. It's still being pushed by a number of actors. Bolsonaro is a crazy herd immunity guy, Trump clearly also, but it's not been actually applied fully anywhere. Okay, in none of the countries it's been applied fully to the extent. But so you can imagine, even though it was not applied fully, the consequences it has had. If it had been applied fully somewhere, you can just only imagine, the consequences in terms of the number of deaths that we would see in those countries. So as I just said, unsurprisingly, the herd immunity strategy has been discussed and defined in a context where social Darwinism has strong roots. And I could share a number of references here on showing the intellectual influence behind some of those people. Even somebody like Trump, who's not the greatest intellectual in the world, but he has actually the way in which it came to him has been through Ayn Rand, not through the books. I don't think he's ever read the books, but he's often said that the movie The Fountainhead, which is taken from Ayn Rand's book, has been a very, very strong influence on him. So that's one path in which and through which social Darwinism has come to the head of people like Donald Trump. So the interesting thing is, again, in the context of COVID and herd immunity strategy, you find the selective affinity between the social Darwinian message in the background and in a sense, free market argument. So in this, the types of things that you've seen, Charlie Kirk from Fox News saying we need to free the American entrepreneur, supposedly from this kind of constraints that the lockdown or other kinds of strategies like that impose on it, or Stephen Moore, a commentator on economic issues that is very connected again to the same, ecology of neoliberal think tanks that I mentioned already. We need to relaunch the economy, otherwise we will see body bags of business. So the kind of interesting comparison between human body bags on the one hand probably being less important than business body bags. So we need to sacrifice human body bags, humans, and accept human body bags in order to not see business body bags. Very particular hierarchy of values. And here I just want to underscore and contrast also now. On the one hand, some people will die, they have to die, this is life. So implicitly it's going to be the weak, because he also says we need to face the virus like men. So we men, strong, okay, implicitly social Darwinian, the strongest, we will face the virus, the others will die. So Brazil, probably this is not even accurate anymore, because this was a few days ago that I looked at the figures, and it's definitely going up, okay. Angela Merkel, very different discourse. All lives are equally valuable and to be protected. The priority should be the minimization of unnecessary deaths. She said that again and again in many different speeches, and we know the numbers here. So, very simple kind of comparison and contrast here. So neoliberal value system, everything should be or could be sacrificed to economic freedom. We see that also in the context of democracy. Right now in a country like the US, you have people strongly arguing that we should get rid of democracy to protect free market or economic freedom, and again, quite a number of people from the Silicon Valley that traditionally see themselves as libertarians, Peter Thiel and many others, defining themselves as libertarians, are now saying we need to get rid of democracy because it's a threat to economic freedom. And this actually was already theorized by Hayek, by Friedman, already in the 80s and 70s. That's the way in which Friedman and Hayek explained their strong involvement in Chile with Pinochet, saying that Chile had never been such a free country as in the period of Pinochet, which obviously they meant free, equal economic freedom, not any other kinds of freedom. So this is okay. So just to go back to our point, in a sense, okay, it's a beyond welfare proposition that I'm making. So basically, what I've tried to show and argue here is that there's really the progress of an intellectual trend, a regime shift, paradigmatic shift here. That is a bit, underground, I would say, in the sense that we don't necessarily always pay attention to it or realize its strength. And that this kind of underground paradigmatic shift might lead us beyond welfare, might actually justify less and less social intervention, might justify the fact that no social intervention is legitimate on efficiency and on moral grounds, so leading to higher forms of society, higher forms of being, etc. With the only form of intervention that would be, therefore, in that context, legitimate at the individual level, either through biological and psychological dynamics. Okay. So yeah, interestingly, yeah, one thing which is partly a contradiction or not, is this notion that there still is this idea of intervention. In principle, a pure Spencerian logic would say laissez-faire, okay, no intervention whatsoever. But in the early phases of eugenism or social Darwinian eugenism, or in this more recent phases of eugenism, you have the theorization of different forms of intervention. So we had policies of eugenism in the 1920s and forward in all countries across the world almost, okay? And again, I said the only country that made it survive for quite long is Sweden until the 70s. And today, we have this strong sense of biological intervention that the transhumanist movement is pushing, in the sense, trying to make us live longer, healthier, younger, etc., which in a sense is a way to temper the natural dynamics of the survival of the fittest. So it's a bit contradictory. And to illustrate this in connection to the COVID, there's this project of viralization, which again got quite a bit of interest in the US. And that was this notion, this proposal by Robin Hanson of the hero hotels. And notice, also the terms used, and the hero, the fittest, and the hero hotels would be hotels where you would actually pay to enter to get quickly and deliberately infected. You would stay until recovered, after which you could leave and be certified to work and socialize. And this could be either completely voluntary, obviously on the part of young people, healthy, etc., that knew that they had little risk, or this could be actually also subsidized or even required. Okay, so kind of a bit of this contradiction, which has always been there with social Darwinism, of in principle no intervention, in reality intervention, but definitely not welfare intervention in the sense that we in this group understand it. Okay, I'm done.
Thanks very much, Marie-Laure. A very fascinating and timely talk, I think. We are running a bit over time, at least the short version, so we may be sort of faithful to our extended version. I think we're still not really running into the lunch break, so I think that's totally fine. What I would do is maybe share a couple of reflections. I will totally limit it to 5 minutes, and then we already had a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll open it up to the larger group right away, so that we, I think, can totally have another maybe 20 minutes of group discussion, if that's okay for everyone. So first of all, I think it's a nice example, especially the connection of freedom to COVID that you've given, but I also think that it doesn't only extend to the institutional level. So you were talking a lot about state leadership, policy, and so on. But when you were talking, I was reminded of these, I don't know if everyone's of you seen these already, these hearings, citizen hearings in the US, where people were sometimes even calling upon their God-given right of freedom to justify that they were not wearing masks because it was stopping their breath, and they would be, taken away their freedom if they were, obliged to wear masks. So I think it's also a cultural issue, and not only one on the institutional or on the policy level, and that's maybe something that we can link up on tomorrow in Helmut's talk, who I think is also going to talk about culture some more. A second point that came into my mind, and that's directly related to social science research, is that I think we're developing a more forceful repertoire of methods to maybe counteract these false projections. So what I was thinking is this book, I don't know if you guys know it, about intersectional inequality by Reagan and Fiss, which is basically reacting to the bell curve that Marie-Laure, you've been mentioning, of Bernstein and Murray, where they've been counteracting this argument and these analyses that we're only looking at race or only at gender and how people excel in their lives. and actually didn't find that much of a systematic inequality that was even worth combating. But when Fiss and Reagan were reanalyzing that data with a qualitative comparative analysis, so a combinatory thinking repertoire, they were showing nicely how the combinations of race, gender, family background, and other factors actually had a huge role to play in inequalities, and was then informing a debate of shouldn't you be actually doing something about it, because it in fact exists, and there's reasons, structural reasons that are maybe worth combating. A second point that I wanted to make, or an issue that I wanted to raise, so you've been saying you wouldn't be talking, or you weren't talking that much about civil society, but maybe I would want to bring that back in the sense of what can civil society and civil society actors do about this? And who would you see as the corrective forces? So is it new economic actors like B corporations, for instance, that are embedded in this system, that maybe have a license to operate even in those systems? So are they going to be the proponents of change, or are they just masking this ideology and even driving it further into that direction? We also had a comment by Gemma on philanthropists, venture philanthropists. So would that actually be an embodiment of this faulty logic, as you were explaining, or would they be able to be game changers in the system, or would it rather be a bottom-up social movement type of action, like on the climate crisis, Extinction Rebellion, or in civil rights and equality or inequality, the Black Lives Matter movement? So I'm interested in where you see dynamics, where you see any promise at all to sort of counteract these very manifested principles across the societies. And then maybe to one last point to close the loop, so to say, going back to what I mentioned about the International Panel for Social Progress. Sorry for my fault to continue this up with Stieglitz and Fitoussi. Probably I just thought Amartya Sen is in this, so it must be some sort of a follow-up. But what is the, in relation to that, what is, in very brief terms, of course, the counterdraft of progress, if you compare it to social Darwinism? Progress as something that's necessary, something that's social Darwinism as something that's necessary and that's leading to progress. What is sort of the counterdraft or the counter action that you came up with in the panel? So it's mainly three things. How does social science research and methods, how are they able to uncover maybe this faulty logic? The second one, what's the role of civil society, and what would be the leading actors or actors that are actually driving this agenda? And what is a sort of counterdraft of progress, and is it likely to succeed? And then we had other points about what does that have to do with feminism. We already had the venture philanthropy issue, and then we can just open it up to everyone else. So maybe you would want to just have a quick reaction to those, or we can open it up directly and see how the discussion unfolds.
Maybe I'll take the second point, the civil society, and how do we see action on this? So, yeah, you're right. I said that it had nothing or not much to do with civil society, but in fact, it's not true, in the sense that I didn't really underscore enough, but that was not the objective of the keynote. The role of a strong civil society movement, which has been, the think tank that I've mentioned. This is a huge role they've played in pushing for this kind of vision of the world. How do we, so there are two ways in which we can counteract that. One is by having similar type of, organized architecture, but for a very different type of agenda. And I've often actually argued this, that we should actually copy-paste the way in which this ecology of think tanks has functioned, to actually push for a very different agenda. To some extent, this is a bit what Soros does, and there are a few places where this is happening, but with much less impact, much less role, much less money, also, and much less real influence on policy than the neoliberal think tank ecology. But that's definitely, in terms of the way in which you should act, it's a kind of an interesting way to look at. The other thing that I'm hopeful about is that the COVID crisis has shown really concretely, and is still showing concretely, the kind of very, in terms of efficiency also, negative consequences of that ideology. You just have to look at the US right now and the mess the country is in, or to some degree the UK too, if you compare it to other countries. So I think that you even see now the re-emergence, and you might see the re-emergence of calls for welfares, more different, more traditional ways, systems of welfare, because they've been proven to save our lives, really. If you look at the non Anglo-Saxon countries, to some degree, at least non-UK, US, or Brazil systems. So the more you've had a functioning welfare system, the better we were off during the COVID crisis, to make it simple. And this has become quite visible. So I think that maybe, hopefully, this might actually lead not only to civil society movements and action. I think the Black Lives Matter is part of that, or it could move that way. So not only from the part of civil society, but also from the part of politicians in general. So yeah, so I'm happy to.
Yeah, I think Gemma had a direct reaction to that. At least I interpreted her raising her hand.
Yeah,
way.
Thank you. No, it was just a quick comment that you mentioned the economics within philanthropy of of the amount of money going into the neoliberal agenda. I think if you were to do an analysis, you'd find that often what happens is that the philanthropic backers of the neoliberal agenda tend to be a lot more strategic and aligned and more willing to get behind one idea. And if you contrast it with the, let's call it a more social justice or welfare-oriented philanthropy, you get a lot more disagreement and diffusion. And it's a consistent pattern in the history of philanthropy. It's really interesting. But it means often that the backers of a neoliberal agenda can be very effective with limited finance, in the analysis I've looked at. So.
Marta wanted to add up on that?
Yeah, so I just wanted shortly to comment on the Swedish case, because there were some questions about it from also in the chat.
Yeah, Marta, Karin was mentioning it, that it didn't seem to fit in that pattern, and Lisa was also saying that.
I think one reason might be that I think it's maybe a misunderstanding that Sweden was pursuing herd immunity, at least as far as I understand from the kind of discourse of the involved authorities. I think it was more the case of them interpreting the kind of, how to say, scientific data a bit differently from the WHO, for example. And the authorities have actually several times tried to clarify that they are not in fact pursuing herd immunity, but they are rather, but that perhaps, and that's not really clear yet, since we know so little about the virus, perhaps some kind of herd immunity will emerge as a side effect of their strategy. So I think in this sense, I think the reasons for Sweden's different strategy were different from the other countries that you use as examples, Marie-Laure. And I mean, it would take like 2 hours to get into the discussion, so we don't need to. But I think that might be one explanation for Sweden as kind of having a different strategy from other countries with well-developed welfare states than.
So, I mean, I've obviously given a lot of thought to the Swedish case because it's really a case that is close to my heart, and I've tried to think, how to make sense of that case on that particular dimension. One, I totally agree with you, Marta, first, that in practice, this has not been a full herd immunity strategy. And as I said in the talk, there hasn't been any country that has really gone all the way to full herd immunity strategy. Even the US has not gone completely that way. So I agree completely on that. I think that what could be interesting is to explore the differences between the politicians on the one hand and the epidemiologists on the one hand, and particularly the chief epidemiologist, which in his case was very clear that that's what he wanted to achieve. I agree with you that maybe the politicians were not really so clear about it, but he has always been very clear, and more recently he has also acknowledged, we have to say, that this was a mistake, okay? And so, but he was always very clear that he had herd immunity as a strategy. And so one thing that came to my mind, but really I have not explored it, and I don't know how to explore it actually. I don't speak enough Swedish so far. Would be one hypothesis that I had was that actually because of this strong eugenist tradition, which was interestingly in the Swedish case very tightly interpenetrated with the social welfare system, with the welfare state system. Because of this, there might be still a tradition in the training of epidemiologists, or at least there might have been a tradition in the training of epidemiologists of the generation of this guy, can't remember his name now, that actually made it quite natural for him to look at the world in that way. So this is the only hypothesis I have so far, a very cultural hypothesis. And I think it, it can be tested. So it can be definitely looked at, the training of those types of people, what kind of textbooks they built on, etc., etc. But it wouldn't be very surprising if you think that actually the eugenist policy phased out in the late 70s in Sweden, that this guy was, I think, 60 or something, would have been trained in a time where those were ideas that were not off the wall in the context of Sweden. Mm. That's the only explanation I can come with.
Yeah. There have been another couple of comments here in the chat, so trying to make sense of the situation. But Michael has also mentioned that it was a strategy in the Netherlands. So I don't know if you'd want to share a couple of insights on that and maybe some reflections on why that is.
Well, it was when the outbreak was just about. It was an official statement of our Prime Minister that we're aiming for herd immunity. It's interesting that term only was used during the first press conference, and later on it disappeared from any official statements. And I agree with Marie-Laure that it's not been fully activated, because there's also has been a major lockdown, and so not necessarily aiming for the weak, you might say, but it was an official strategy, and it was also framed as something that was very much based in a medical professional expertise. So I'm curious, Marie-Laure, how that's also maybe part of the discourses in other countries, how the medical professional discourse is used as a legitimating factor for the herd immunity strategy.
Is that a question, Michael?
Maybe, yeah.
I'm not sure I have an answer, but it's clear that what is really interesting is that it has been framed as a scientific strategy in many of the countries that have used it. It's been framed as a scientific strategy. But again, when I did a bit of work on that to write this pieces on herd immunity during the COVID, and again, they are in French, they're not in English, but what I discovered by going myself into the medical literature on this is that it's only used in the medical literature in the context of vaccines. It's never used when you don't have vaccines. So this scientific legitimation is bogus, really. So then, you know, if that's bogus, then how do you explain that it takes root or that it takes hold in certain countries more than in others? Then my hypothesis here is that it is, in a sense, it resonates. There's an elective affinity between this and a dominant substratum, intellectual substratum that carries threads of social Darwinism. That, you know, in the sense, if I would summarize my argument, that's what I would make.
Maybe as a side remark, before I pass on the word to Lisa, who had a question about how this relates to feminism and how we could make sense of it from that perspective. Even in Germany, it has been used very, very briefly, but at least sort of it even took up in conversations with friends and neighbors who were then saying, well, I mean, what chance do we have to tackle this, right? So we can lock down forever, or we need to aim for this. So at some point, even policy leaders have been using it. And as you were saying, not in the context of, you know, we need to aim for having vaccines for that amount of people or that share of people, but that's actually sort of the two scenarios that we have. And the one sort of doesn't seem to work because it's going to, you know, just blow up the economy. And so, well, that's the only chance we have, so to say, but it went away quite quickly and was never officially used as a strategy.
Never officially taken. And if you really look at the speeches of Angela Merkel,
yeah, sure,
always
no,
on the
absolutely.
priority,
So she's been
on the priority of human lives over the economy, which, you know, as I argued also in the kind of herd immunity / neoliberal, you know, vision. This is not so clear that human lives is higher than the economy.
Yeah. So maybe let's pass it on to Lisa and take the feminism aspect as the one to close with. So let's aim for maybe 12:30 to wrap it up because probably some of you maybe have other appointments waiting. But Lisa, please.
Okay, thank you, and thank you so much, Marie-Laure, for that. It's been really interesting, and I think also this whole discussion about Sweden, and I'm actually Swedish myself, but living in Spain, and my parents live in the US, so we've had all of these discussions about, you know, how are the different countries dealing with this and why, and I think your explanation is very interesting, so thank you. My question was related to feminism, and when I heard your speech, I was thinking that a lot of what you're saying when you're explaining social Darwinism sounds kind of opposite of feminist ideals of, you know, taking care of the weak, community, etc. So that was one observation, and then the other one was then also thinking about the countries that you explained are actually applying social Darwinism seem to be also suppressing women more and more recently. So do you see any connections there?
You know, obviously, yeah. Obviously, social Darwinism is projecting this this vision. The superior is a man. Yeah, you know, obviously, the fittest is in the perspective of Herbert Spencer. It's not even in discussion of women at the end of the 19th century in that context. So really, and even Darwinism to some degree. But Spencerism even more, with this notion that actually the strongest are those that spread most, okay? This vision of male capacity to reproduce, the strong alpha male, you know, capacity to reproduce. So unsurprisingly, you have all those, you know, things that fit very well also with persons, individual persons like Trump or Bolsonaro, etc. So this is part of their view of the world. All this goes together. So very, very true that from a Spencerian perspective, there's implicitly, it's never really discussed, but implicitly superiority of men over women. That's for sure. Interestingly, in the COVID crisis, also we can notice that, you know, and I've put that a number of times on social networks, not knowing what to do with this, but if you look at the more successful states in terms of managing COVID from the perspective of reducing human death, unnecessary human death, the countries that have been more successful in that sense have been run by women. So I don't know what to do with this. It's just something that it's descriptive at this stage. Yeah, there's a lot of intervening variables. Many of those countries are small, etc., etc. So it's obviously very difficult to generalize. But even if you compare the way in which France dealt with the situation with the way in which Germany dealt with the situation, just right there, two countries more or less the same size, you had a very different philosophy, and then clearly a much more caring philosophy in the context of Germany to deal with the crisis. Even though in the end France was not so bad as it could have been when it started. So I'm not sure I want to push this much further, because obviously there would be much more work to be done on pushing this insights. But yes, I mean, not feminism really, but this gendered stereotyping has something to do with the whole story, definitely. I'm not sure feminism per se has something to do with it, but gendered stereotyping has something to do with that story.
I think it's fascinating that we're sort of teasing out apparently it's resting on several factors at the same time, which sort of brings us back to maybe the power of QCA analysis, in the sense of combining the factors and then really seeing how the reaction to COVID is based on those, because it doesn't seem to be one thing in particular, right? You've mentioned professional education. We've talked about very sort of ingrained ideas in culture. We've talked about political leadership. And so this is definitely, I think, something worthwhile, and probably not being pursued in that way. It's more of, I think the research that's happening now is sort of this, how are actors reacting? How are organizations reacting? How do they manage the crisis? But really looking at the sort of at the roots of this and effective responses to obviously what matters most, right? Saving lives would make for a very interesting.
But at least what matters most for us, because clearly this is not the case in big parts of the US or in big parts of Brazil right now.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for a fascinating talk and for a great discussion.